Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here. So happy to have the chance to come to this meeting. Thank you very much to the organisers, and thank you for the award. And thank you for coming to my talk. So I'm going to talk today about the neural basis of semantic cognition, focusing on how we can generate different aspects of semantic behaviour at different times. So we know our concepts must be heteromodal because we can access the meanings of things from different inputs. So we can recognise meanings of words, we can recognise objects, we can even recognise environmental sounds or smells. And obviously we also know about the valence of different concepts. And it's assumed that concepts are formed when we merge these different features, which we extract over different experiences, to form an abstracted concept. But this store of knowledge, which might be generated in a semantic hub system, is thought not to be sufficient for successful semantic cognition. And that's because you can instantiate your concepts differently. So you can, for example, activate different features for the same concept at different times, depending on what the task requirements are or what the context is. For example, if you think about a dog and you're thinking about a family pet, you might come up with warm, fuzzy feelings about a lovely pet dog that you know. But if I gave you a different context of a guard dog, then you come up with a very different valence for this concept. And so I'm going to talk about how the conceptual representations that are formed in your heteromodal brain regions might interact with control mechanisms to allow you to generate this pattern of flexible semantic behaviour. So I'm going to start by talking about where and how concepts are abstracted in the brain. And I'll talk about the idea that there is feature integration in transmodal cortex at the top of a hierarchy that you can think about in the cortex in terms of sort of graded transformations from unimodal sensory-motor features into abstract concepts. And then I'll talk about how we can generate different patterns of retrieval depending on the context. And I'll talk about three different aspects of flexibility. I'll talk about how we can generate different modes of semantic cognition, depending on whether we need to generate conceptual information sort of internally, or if we are paying attention to the external world and recognizing the objects around us. I'll talk about how our task goals matter. So our task goals might allow us to gate the sensory responses in an adaptive way. And I'll also talk about how we can generate different aspects of conceptual knowledge depending on the context. And I'll talk about how different systems in the brain seem to be important for more habitual patterns of semantic retrieval compared with more kind of creative, unusual aspects of retrieval that we can generate. So the idea that heteromodal concepts are formed in a hub system from the integration of different features is an idea that I associate very strongly with Carolyn Patterson and also Matt Lamb-Ralph, who for a number of years were doing work with patients with semantic dementia in Cambridge. And these are patients who have they have degradation of a brain region shown here in yellow, the anterior temporal lobes. And it's associated with a pattern of progressive semantic impairment, which affects different kinds of tasks, different input modalities, for example, including the association for words and pictures. And their semantic impairment is very predictable. So if you measure their ability to access concept in one modality, that will tell you whether they're going to be able to do the same task in the other modality. And the assumption is that there's a central semantic representation that's accessed by these different modalities. And as it degrades, this explains why you have this very strong level of predictability for an individual patient about which concepts they know and which ones they don't know. And there's also supporting evidence from lots of fMRI studies. So we can see that in fMRI, there's a multimodal response to semantic tasks in the anterior temporal lobes, especially the lateral and more ventral parts of the ATL. So while the anterior STG might respond more to words and the anterior fusiform might respond more to pictures, this zone in the middle seems to respond equally to both modalities. And this led to us suggesting this graded hub idea, where information is integrated. And the regions of the brain which are equidistant and furthest from these sensory motor inputs might be the bit of the brain which is most heteromodal. So this idea that the location of a brain region is critical for understanding its function, we've explored it across the whole brain in this work looking at the organisation of functional connectivity data. So this is work that was led by Daniel Margulies, And the way that you do this kind of analysis, this gradient analysis, is you can look at a sort of parcellation of the brain. You can look at the time series correlation between each of the pairs of parcels. And so that gives you a large matrix of connectivity. And then you can look at its decomposition. And if you do that, then the component of the connectivity matrix that explains most variance is shown here on the left-hand side. So we call this a principal gradient of intrinsic connectivity because it explains the most variance and it captures the functional separation between heteromodal cortex, shown in red, and unimodal cortex, shown in blue. And of course, the ATL is at the heteromodal end of this principal gradient, but it's not unique in showing this sort of transmodal response. So other areas of the brain, like the angular gyrus, for example, are also far up the principal gradient, so far away from unimodal systems, and that might be associated with the ability of these brain regions to process inputs across modalities and in cognitive contexts where the external world is not necessarily driving our cognition. So importantly, the principal gradient correlates with cortical distance, sort of physical distance on the cortical surface. For example, both the anterior temporal lobe and the angular gyrus are situated in locations which are maximally distant from sensory motor landmarks. And also the principal gradient can explain the order of networks on the cortical surface in multiple locations. So as you move along the principal gradient in multiple parts of the brain, you'll go from the default mode network at the extreme end through cognitive control networks, through attention networks, and then finally reaching the sensory motor regions. So I'm going to talk today about how we can use the principal gradient to understand the organization of semantic cognition, and in particular the flexibility that we have in our semantic system. And that the principal gradient offers the opportunity to resolve a few debates that have kind of long-standing debates, arguments, if you like, about the neural organization of semantic processing. So through the decades, different research groups have emphasized different brain regions as being important for conceptual processing. So there's the anterior temporal lobe, and we know that that region might be important for patients with semantic dementia. But neuroimaging studies have also highlighted the potentially important role, for example, of the angular gyrus. Of course, these brain regions might not have identical functions, but the principal gradient helps us to understand why they might have similar response properties, because both of these regions are able to support aspects of cognition that are divorced from the environment around us. So they might support, for example, abstract concepts. There's also been a lot of debate about what's the functional role of the default mode network. And we know that the default mode network regions are associated with a range of different functions, including semantic cognition, but also episodic memory, things like social cognition. And it might be that the principal gradient also helps us to understand why the default mode network supports a range of different functions, because all of these functions might be examples of situations where cognition requires some degree of separation from the external environment, because you have to process things that are based in your memory or that require abstraction. So I thought I'd start by telling you about an experiment which we designed to try to test the predictions of this principal gradient of counter cognition. So the basic idea about the principal gradient is that the types of cognition you see in the default mode network should be ones which are essentially distant from input. But there are different ways you can be distant from input. So you can be distant from input in terms of the representational structure. So abstract concepts require you to be separated, but require a separation of representation from the sensory motor features, because the sensory motor features will vary across the different experiences which you use to learn about a concept. And so you're kind of ending up with this kind of germ of an idea which is abstracted from those features. But there are also types of cognition where you have to generate something from memory, and you might have to perform a task where the information that you need for the task is no longer in the environment around you, but is in your head. So in this experiment, we looked at 4 different conditions. So people had to make a decision about an object presented in the middle of the screen. They had to decide if it was more similar to the object on the left or the right-hand side. So there's a green apple in the middle of the screen there, and you have to match it to the red apple on the left-hand side and not the orange on the right-hand side. And in that particular trial, those items are all on the screen, so you can make that decision based on the perceptual input interacting with your conceptual knowledge. Now we can contrast that situation with one where you have to make a decision from memory. So you see the Labrador in the middle, And then you have to decide which of the two dogs on the previous trial was most similar to the one in the middle. So here there's a need to retrieve information. The information for the task is no longer on the screen. And then there was also conditions which involved not meaningful objects anymore, but single features, which were color patches. And people had to decide which of the two blues was most similar to the blue in the middle. And again, they had to do this either when the information was on the screen or using memory of what the color patches were on the previous trial. And the simple contrast of the one-back memory-based condition over the zero-back perceptual condition activates regions at the top of the principal gradient, as does the comparison of meaningful objects over colors. So this includes regions like the anterior temporal lobes and the angular gyrus, and quite a lot of other regions in the default mode network. And interestingly, when you look at the response along the principal gradient for the four conditions, you can see that it's the condition where you have to use memory, but also for meaningful objects, which particularly drives a strong response at the top of the gradient. So in this analysis, what we're doing is looking at bins of voxels along the principal gradient in space and just extracting the data in those regions so that we can see that there's a linear trend for the object-based one-back condition. Now, in that situation, in that experiment, the need to generate information from memory was sort of, not, it was kind of helpful. That's what we had to do in the task. But very often, when we generate information from memory, it actually interferes with an ongoing cognitive process that we're trying to do. For example, we've all had the experience of when we're reading, we're trying to read some kind of like technical thing and it's a little bit dull or we're not quite following it, and then we start mind wandering. So we start producing meaningful information internally and not paying attention anymore to the external meaningful information that we should be tracking the meaning of. So in many situations, sort of internally generated and externally generated semantic information is in opposition. And we wanted to know how the brain can generate these different cognitive states. So in this study, led by Mai Chao Zhang, we set up a task where people were asked to read sentences word by word, or they were asked to generate autobiographical memories from a cue word when they previously, outside the scanner, associated these keywords with an episode from their lives. And so we set up a kind of task conflict where if you're doing the reading task, sometimes you see an autobiographical memory cue, which you essentially have to ignore. And similarly, when you're doing the autobiographical memory task, sometimes you see the sentences, which you also have to ignore. Now, there was some kind of common activation across these conditions in temporal regions and a little bit in the inferior frontal gyrus. But the thing that was very clear is that these two conditions are very different in terms of the responses that they elicit. So this is the task contrast with the brain regions that are more responsive to reading in red and the autobiographical memory responses in blue. And you can see that both tasks activate parts of the default mode network. The autobiographical memory task activates a lot of the core DMN regions, including angular gyrus and the posterior cingulate cortex and medial prefrontal cortex, while the reading task activates lateral temporal regions, which are in the default mode network, and a little bit of the inferior frontal gyrus in the default mode network. And if you look at the connectivity at rest of these default mode regions activated by these two tasks, you see a very different pattern. And the point that's important for our story here is that the parts of the default mode network which are more responsive to reading are also more connected to visual cortex. So that's the red regions. In contrast, the blue default mode regions sort of just like to communicate with other default mode regions. So because the participants were trying to do two tasks at once, on every trial we asked them to rate how attentive they were to the task they were supposed to be doing. And this is the parametric effect of task focus. So the blue regions are the areas where there was more activation when participants reported they were more focused on the autobiographical memory task. And so regions of angular gyrus and medial prefrontal cortex, for example, are more active when people are paying more attention to the autobiographical memory task. They're less distracted by the reading task. But there are other parts of the default mode network in red, which are the opposite pattern. So this is where more activation is bad news in terms of being on task for autobiographical memory. So the sort of story that emerges across these different analyses is that the reason that we might be able to generate different modes of cognition, some internal and some external, is at the top of the gradient. There are some brain regions which have more connectivity to vision, and there are other brain regions which actually sort of separate from vision. And we have a sort of additional analysis from another data set which helps to confirm this view. So this is looking at individual differences now in intrinsic connectivity between the default mode peak for the reading task. So this is a lateral temporal cortex peak, looking at its connectivity dependent on how good people are at reading comprehension and also how much they do mind wandering while they're reading. And so we found that people who had stronger connectivity between the lateral default mode network, important for reading, and visual cortex, were better at comprehending what they were reading, and they also reported less mind wandering experiences while they were reading. So we might be able to generate different modes of semantic cognition by activating different parts of the default mode network, which have different connectivity to visual regions. And in situations where we find we mind wander while we're reading, perhaps it's because we activate some of these parts of the default mode network which are visually decoupled, and that then takes us away from the task of reading comprehension. Okay, so far I've talked about how we abstract concepts, the importance of feature integration in transmodal cortex, and the idea that we can generate different types, different modes of semantic cognition, if you will, by activating different parts of transmodal cortex that have different connectivity profiles. What I want to do now is talk about the control processes that might allow us to shape semantic retrieval to suit the circumstances. So I'm going to talk about a network that we call the semantic control network. I'm going to try to convince you that it's not identical to the multiple demand network. So it's not exactly the same as brain regions that have been commonly described that allow people to do demanding tasks across all different domains. And then I'll talk about this idea that we can gate feature activation based on our task goals, and how we can actually generate different patterns of conceptual retrieval according to the context. Okay, so there are different large-scale networks which are important for semantic cognition. And I've talked so far about this network on the left-hand side, the default mode network, and I've argued that it supports aspects of cognition that are distant from sensory input, including abstract aspects of semantic cognition. But if you do a semantic task in the scanner, then you tend to see a lot of activation in the green network. And this is meta-analysis, which shows that if you're doing a semantic task which is more demanding, in terms of requiring you to access the meaning of ambiguous words, or requiring you to access weaker semantic relationships, or requiring you to make a semantic decision when there's stronger distractors, you'll get more activation in this green network, which is why we refer to it as the semantic control network, because its response seems to be modulated by the control demands of the semantic task. And if I show you the multiple demand network, you can see that it's not sort of spatially identical to the multiple demand network, but you can probably see that there is a spatial relationship between these three networks. So the semantic control network sits in between default mode regions on the one hand, and multiple demand regions that respond to executive demands across different task domains on the other. So the multiple demand network is the network that John Duncan and colleagues have described, which is activated by a whole range of different hard tasks, and it's associated with processes like selection, inhibition, and goal maintenance. So some of our initial evidence for a dissociation between these networks came from neuropsychology. And when we were comparing patients with semantic dementia who have multimodal semantic deficits with people who also have multimodal semantic deficits, so they fail the same range of semantic tasks as a consequence of having left hemisphere stroke. And we found that although these patient groups are sort of quantitatively similar in the sense they fail the same tasks, they are qualitatively different. So patients with semantic dementia are not very responsive to task demands. So the context in which you present a concept doesn't matter. If they can't do it on one task, they won't be able to do it on another. But they're very, very sensitive to familiarity and frequency. And that's probably because these variables predict how strongly encoded a concept is, and consequently how well it will withstand the neurodegeneration in the condition. They also show relatively weak effects of cueing. So, you can give them lots of help to try and get them to come out with a concept, but if the concept's degraded, then they won't be able to. So the cues are relatively ineffective. In contrast, patients with semantic aphasia show much stronger effects of task demands. If you manipulate the control demands of a semantic task, you can take them from being relatively normal performance to very poor performance. They're not sensitive to frequency and familiarity effects in the same way, and they're much more sensitive to cueing, suggesting that they've got a lot more information about the meanings of concepts that they can't normally retrieve. And this dissociation between these two patient groups is associated with the distinction between storage and access semantic impairments that was made by Elizabeth Warrington many moons ago.
So this is evidence that it's not the same brain regions necessarily that represent long-term heteromodal concepts that also allow us to generate this flexible semantic behaviour and retrieve weak associations. There might be more than one process that has to interact in order to generate semantic cognition. But one of the things which has always been very difficult about this work is that patients with semantic aphasia tend to also have difficulties on executive tasks outside the semantic domain. And that's perhaps not surprising, since we know that the multiple demand network is adjacent to semantic control regions in the left hemisphere. So if you have a left hemisphere stroke that affects the semantic control network, it will likely also affect multiple demand regions in that hemisphere. So in this recent work led by Nick Suter, we asked whether we could separate semantic deficits from executive deficits outside the semantic domain using lesion symptom mapping approaches. And the executive task that we're looking at here is the Brixton spatial anticipation test, where people see an array of dots, and there's a kind of highlighted dot that moves around between trials, and you have to make a prediction about where the dot will be next. So it's highly sensitive to dysexecutive syndrome. So this is a set of patients where we have structural scans, and if we do lesion symptom mapping in the ordinary way, so looking at which voxels, the damage to which voxels predicts semantic impairment versus executive impairment, then in both cases we get a left hemisphere cluster or clusters. So semantic impairment is associated with more damage essentially to left prefrontal, parietal and temporal regions that are within or adjacent to the semantic control network, whereas the executive deficit is predicted by a sort of similar cluster in frontal parietal cortex. But there's a very different pattern when we look at what we call disconnection symptom mapping. So here we're using the BCP toolkit from Michel Theobald-Deschotten and colleagues. And the BCP toolkit allows you to estimate where a particular patient might have white matter disconnection based on the voxels which are damaged. So you can essentially track through what their lesion would look like if you had diffusion weighted imaging data for that patient. You can estimate it based on the structural scan. And using this method, what we found was that disconnection in the left hemisphere between similar kind of semantic regions was predictive of semantic impairment. But a very different pattern of disconnection predicted this difficulty on the Brixton spatial anticipation task. And you can see it most clearly, I think, in the bottom coronal view, where you can see it's the corpus callosum, so it's cross-hemispheric connectivity between the two hemispheres, which predicts difficulty on this non-semantic task. And this is consistent with the idea that semantic control is a left lateralized function, while domain general executive control is bilateral. So you can see some of the similar dissociations using other methods. This is a recent study using fMRI by Jia Gao. And in this study, we compared easy and difficult semantic decisions with easy and difficult verbal working memory decisions. So we wanted to have a verbal domain because people often say, well, are you sure it's not a language control network? So it's useful to be able to compare a verbal semantic task with a verbal non-semantic task. So the semantic task involves manipulating how similar two concepts. If you decide two concepts are related, then it's easier to do that if they have many similarities between them. If you decide two concepts are unrelated, it's also easy to do that when they share no features. So we can look at both of those kinds of trials. And in the working memory task, we manipulated working memory load. So how many letters do you have to maintain in order to do the task? So this just shows the pattern of activation in these different conditions. It's a parametric analysis of difficulty and left inferior frontal gyrus and a region of pre-supplementary motor area, which is also in the semantic control network. They responded to the semantic difficulty. The working memory task gives us a bit of a different pattern with more of a right hemisphere dorsolateral prefrontal cortex cluster, and also a common activation in this pre-supplementary motor area. If you just extract the signal from the different networks which are important for semantic cognition, you get a similar pattern. So this is looking at the red regions are areas of the brain implicated in semantic processing, but outside our semantic control network, so there's no evidence that they respond to difficulty. The yellow regions, the semantic control network, excluding any voxels that fall within John Duncan's multiple demand network. The green voxels are the ones, the semantic control voxels, which are within the multiple demand network. And then the blue voxels are the rest of the multiple demand network, but there's no evidence it's interested in semantic cognition at all. When you look at the data this way, there's a similar pattern for the two semantic conditions, the related and unrelated ones. Difficult trials elicit stronger response in these semantic control regions, but we don't get the same response for the blue voxels. So there's no similar response in the multiple demand network. The working memory task, we only see the effect of working memory load in multiple demand regions that are actually also within the semantic control region, and that might be because it is a language task. But we don't see activation in the voxels which are only to do with semantic control and outside the multiple demand network. So the other thing that GIAO did was look at cross-task decoding of difficulty. So in this analysis, we are training a classifier on a difficulty of, for example, the related semantic trials, and then we're testing it in for the difficulty of the unrelated semantic trials. And all of the networks can actually cross-classify difficulty within the semantic domain, but there is an advantage for the control networks over the network which is not implicated in control. And then when we look at cross-classification of difficulty between the semantic tasks and the working memory task, only the multiple demand regions are able to do that. So this shows us that there's a different multivariate pattern that's related to difficulty for semantic tasks in the semantic control network. Okay, so I've talked about the fact that there's multiple networks implicated in semantic cognition. What we now want to know is how we can understand their topographical arrangement in terms of the principal gradient, which we know captures the order of networks more generally. So this is work that was led by Sherry Wang, and in this study, Sherry asked participants to match concept words by their colour. So for example, you have to match strawberry and raspberry because they're both kind of pinkish things, or you have to match tomato and postbox because they're both red. And what we manipulated was the level of global semantic similarity between these features. It's orthogonal to the task that's being performed, and I think that's probably critical for the way the analysis comes out. So we've manipulated semantic similarity, but that's not what you're deciding about. So the middle panel shows the pattern of the parametric variable across the whole brain. And the red colours are areas which showed a stronger response when there's more global semantic similarity between the items being matched, whereas the blue areas show the opposite pattern, so more response when they have very few features in common, only the one you're deciding about. And you can hopefully see by eye that there's a correlation, spatial correlation between this parametric task effect and Daniel's principal gradient shown on the top right. And the bar chart is another of these analyses where we've divided the principal gradient up into bins. We've extracted the signal for each of those bins just to see if there's a linear change along the gradient for this semantic manipulation. You can see that there is. So the top end of the gradient responds more in situations where there's more semantic information that's overlapping between the items that you're deciding about. The other thing that Sherry did in this study was to look at where the different networks that are implicated in semantic cognition lie in terms of this gradient. So now we've got two gradients. We've got one that's based on our task data, that's on the left-hand side, and we've got another one that's based on the connectivity analysis at rest, which is the right-hand side. And both of these gradients can differentiate the order of these networks so that there's a systematic shift in their location along the cortical surface. Now, I've mentioned a couple of times that semantic control is a strongly left lateralized function, and in that way it's quite different from domain general control. So you might think to yourself, I wonder if there are any interesting differences in the principal gradient in terms of laterality. And the answer is yes, there are. So this is work that Tirso Gonzalez-Alam led, and in this study, Tirso compared the gradient values for equivalent parcels in the left and right hemisphere at rest. And the red regions are areas of the brain where the gradient value in the left hemisphere is higher than it is in the equivalent parcel in the right hemisphere, while the blue regions show the opposite pattern, so higher in the right hemisphere than the left hemisphere. There's lots of interesting things you could pull out of this plot, but I'll just highlight at the moment the fact that the red regions are corresponding, not perfectly, but to a large extent with the semantic control network. So the semantic control network is left lateralized, and also areas of the brain which kind of correspond with those with that functional network tend to have a higher gradient value in the left hemisphere, which means that they tend to be closer to the default mode network in the left hemisphere. And to prove that this is important, we also looked at whether it was able to predict individual differences in behaviour.
So we found that participants who show this pattern more, so participants for whom the red regions are even higher up the gradient in the left hemisphere, have better semantic performance. But this gradient difference between the left and right hemispheres doesn't predict, for example, ravens or other tasks we looked at. Okay, so I've talked about semantic control processes in terms of where they are in the brain, and I've talked about the difference between the semantic control network and the multiple demand network. So there are some differences, I think, which to do with hemispheric lateralizations. The semantic control network is strongly left lateralized, and these networks are distinct but adjacent regions along the principal gradient. So what I want to do now in the end of the last part of the talk is to talk about some studies where we're looking at different types of flexible semantic behaviour. So first of all, the idea that the task goals can gate feature activation, the idea that temporal cortex can determine the meanings that we're retrieving, and finally, looking at how the connectivity of the semantic control network might respond to the task demands. And I'm going to refer to this as sort of flexing the gradient. Okay, so this is another study from Mai Chao. It's looking at the effect of task instructions. So in this study, participants were asked to make semantic decisions about pairs of words presented one at a time. And there might have been a pair of words like cow and elephant, which are related because they're both from the animal category. So that's a taxonomic link. Or they could be words like cow and grass. Obviously, the cow eats the grass, but grass isn't an animal. So that's a thematic link. And on some trials, participants were told in advance what the nature of the link was going to be, although they didn't know specifically what the concepts were. And in other cases, participants just didn't know what the task was going to be. They didn't know what type of decision they had to make. So on the left-hand side, that's the increase in bold response when you know what you're going to have to do in advance compared with when you don't know what you've got to do. So the left inferior frontal gyrus responds to the sort of ability to maintain a semantic goal, if you like, that you can then apply to subsequent retrieval. It's overlapping with our semantic control network. That's the yellow voxels, the ones that overlap. And it's also in the same part of the brain as the contrast between weak and strong associations, which is shown there in blue. In contrast, the effect of the type of semantic decision you've got to make was in the temporal lobe, both the anterior temporal lobe and also part of the medial temporal cortex, you can see there. And perhaps most interestingly, we found that this task instruction manipulation changed the response in visual cortex. So because the words were presented one at a time, you can look at the activation in visual cortex to each of the words individually. And this effect is an interaction essentially between word 1 versus 2 and the effect of having instructions versus no instructions. So visual cortex, when you don't know what it is you have to retrieve, doesn't really activate. In fact, if anything, you suppress activation to the first word. And this might be because you just don't know what kinds of features you have to retrieve. It's not helpful to fully instantiate the concept at that point in the task. It's only when you get to the second word, which determines what kind of things you have to retrieve about that concept, that you see a response in visual cortex. In contrast, if you know what you have to retrieve in advance, then you see a more equivalent response to the two words. Now, obviously, if you encounter a word like apple in a sequence of words, it can mean very different things depending on whether it follows the word salad compared with if it follows the word computer. And we want to know more about how the brain can generate different patterns of retrieval based on the context in which you encounter a word. So in this study led by Jia Gao, we looked at the brain's response to the word apple, and we looked at the association between neural pattern similarity and semantic models of how similar the meanings of different words are. So we're using two different semantic models here. The left-hand side model is insensitive to the context of the word. So this is based on word2vec, and you can extract the similarities, you can extract the meanings of each word. You can compute the similarity for each pair of words in the experiment. But the representation of apple in this semantic model doesn't depend on the context. It's the same, no matter what the context that word appears in. We can contrast that with another semantic model, ELMO, which has got a kind of context layer in it, which tracks the meaning of a word dependent on the previous words the model's already been presented with. So ELMO, unlike word2vec, has the capacity to represent the context-dependent meaning of these words like apple. So we didn't find any bits of the brain which responded in a positive direction to words of BACN models. So we didn't find any regions which could decode the context-independent meaning of a word. All we found was that in the visual cortex, there's actually less similarity between concepts which are similar in words of BACN. So apple and orange, for example, are less similar in visual cortex. And that's probably because when they're presented with computer, they no longer have similar visual features. But there were a range of different regions that responded to the Model 2 analysis, so that were representing the context-dependent meaning of apple. And these regions cut across different functional networks. So we've got left inferior frontal gyrus, which is associated with semantic control, but we've also got angular gyrus, which is in the default mode network, and also parts of the medial temporal lobe there. And when we do an analysis by network, the only thing you have to worry about in this graph is the big green bars. So this shows that all 4 networks that we've looked at here are able to represent the context-dependent meaning of words, only on trials where participants have detected a relationship between these words. So they said, yes, the words are related. On trials where they said, no, the words aren't related, we didn't find the same pattern. So all the networks which we've implicated in semantic processing are tracking the context-dependent meaning of the word. That's what we can decode. We can't yet decode context-independent meanings, although they must be represented in the brain, obviously. Okay, I've got 2 more studies left to tell you about, and this one is looking at the fact that although these networks all represent context-dependent meaning, they don't necessarily make the same contribution to these tasks. So this is work that was led by Katja Kruiver-Redwood, and in her study, we asked people to generate a link between 2 words. So you can give people any pair of words, and they can always come up with some kind of link. And she manipulated the strength of association between the words that people had to link. So it's very similar to the previous studies. And we find that if you have to link words which are further apart in semantic space, it takes more, it's more difficult. So you get a stronger response to the semantic control network. But then we asked people, how were they generating these links? And so they rated on each trial whether they were, to what extent they were using episodic memory as well as semantic memory to generate a link. And in trials where people were judging, where they were coming up with a link between strongly associated words, people reported they were using episodic memory more often, and we get more activation of the default mode network. And this overlaps with our strong associations there. And then we analysed how unusual the responses were by comparing each individual person's response with all the other responses we had from all the participants in the study. So if people had produced a really unusual response, we got more activation of the semantic control network, which overlaps with the response in the brain to having weak associations you have to link. And so this suggests that different networks are important for more stereotypical or habitual patterns of semantic cognition and more creative or unusual patterns of semantic cognition, despite the fact that all these networks are tracking the context-dependent meaning. And the very last analysis I wanted to tell you about is again by G.I. Gauss. This is a reanalysis of that data that I just talked about. And this is looking at how the connectivity of the semantic control network might change according to the task demands. So in this analysis, we're looking at the multivariate pattern similarity across trials. And we're asking if 2 parts of the brain, 2 parcels in the analysis, are tracking similarity in the same way as each other or in different ways. So this is sometimes referred to as informational connectivity, because the assumption is if 2 brain regions respond in a similar way to the varying task demands, they must be somehow in communication. So at the top there, the top row, you've got Daniel Margulies' principal gradient. So the yellow regions, the default mode regions at the top of the gradient. And the bottom row shows how this informational connectivity metric changes dependent on this strength of associations. We've done the analysis repeatedly looking at sets of words with different levels of sense of association strength so that we can see how this pattern changes. And the interesting thing is that, that when you're judging, when you're coming up with a link, sorry, for more related words, the top end of the gradient is closer to the apex, closer to the default mode network in its connectivity space. While when you're judging, when you're generating these more unusual associations, it's the opposite. So these areas that are close to the apex of the gradient actually move further away towards the sensory motor end of the gradient. And although different semantic networks showed this pattern. It's especially the semantic control network that seems to be flexing its connectivity in response to the task demands in this way. So by changing its connectivity away from the default mode network towards sensory motor features, it might allow us to generate more unusual semantic associations. Okay, so I've talked about how we integrate different concepts and how we can generate, how the brain tracks the context-dependent meaning of words. I've talked about how we have a semantic control network, which is distinct from multiple demand regions, and how this semantic control network seems to be important for maintaining task goals and for identifying weak associations, and how it changes its connectivity based on those task demands so that it moves away from the default mode network to generate more unusual responses. And I'd just like to end by thanking all the people who did who led the studies there. Also, other members of my group, both present and past, and all my collaborators. Particularly, I wanted to thank Johnny, Daniel, and Boris for their contributions to the gradient work, and Matt and Carolyn for their contributions to the graded semantic hub idea. Thank you.